Hello and welcome to another comedian's interview for my blog Arichcomiclife. My name is Richard Gill and my blog describes my experiences of watching over 800 stand-ups and counting over the last 46 years. My guest today is the brilliant comedian Mr. Kevin Day. Yes!
Oh,
Yes! Hello,
yeah,
mate. How are you?
I'm welling. Just the sound of applause. I've missed that so much. Oh my God! I'll happily. In the old days, the sound of one person clapping in a room would have been a terrible thing. But it's wonderful just to hear any sort of applause at all. Thank you. I'm well, Richard. Thank you so much for asking me. It's very kind.
Absolute pleasure. The honour is all mine, my friend. Thank you so much for doing this. We're going to talk about your career in comedy, and I'd like to go right back to the start and ask you, how did you become a comedian in the first place?
Well, I had no ambitions whatsoever. There was no showbiz in my family. I'm from an Anglo-Irish family, so there was a lot of humour about. There was a lot of jokes, but I never had any interest in comedy. And I'm never quite sure. I believe comedians who say at the age of 7 they were watching telly, learning how to become comedians. I just don't. It's like when people say to me, "Who is your favourite comic when you were 7?" It's like, who's got a favourite comic when they're 7? It just. But in the early '80s, off the back of punk, when alternative comedy was taking the place of music in South London, a lot of music venues closed down and were replaced by comedy venues. We started going to one in particular, Banana Cabaret in Balham.
Know it well, yeah.
So 7 or 8 of us would go on a Saturday night, and I would enjoy it, but I was the one who I wouldn't say I critiqued it, but I was also the one who would kind of go, £3 for this, really, for listening to some middle class kid wank off about how tricky his life is. It's like, it eventually, basically, to shut me up, some friends of mine organised an open spot for me, and they surprised me with this knowledge. They said, "Look, you see how clever you are and how funny you are." And they booked me an open spot at the Meccano Club in Camden,
right.
which I duly did. And I was nervous, but I wasn't terrified, because I was going to do it once and get it over with, just to show him I could do it. And then it didn't occur to me that I'd ever do it again. And it went well enough. It was compared by the much missed James Macabre. I was going to say, I nearly said much loved, but much loved would have been an exaggeration. I loved him, but not everyone else did. And it was fine. It went. I'd cobbled together an act, a 5-minute act. It went well enough for the chap who ran it, a chap called Mark, who unfortunately is also no longer with us, to say, "Do you want to come back and do another 5 minutes?" I went, "No, I'm fine, thank you. I'm done." And he said, "No, just come back and do another 5 minutes." So I went back and did another 5 minutes, and I was intrigued by it enough so that over the next couple of weeks at Banana Cabaret, I started watching the acts with a different sort of perspective. And then I started talking to Bob Boyton, because until then I just thought you had to be, and there was no working class chip on my shoulder involved. I just thought you had to be either a drama student or a graduate to be a comedian. It's like acting. Whereas I met Bob Boyton, who was very much not a drama student or a comedian. Bob was a bisexual Stalinist whose act was earthy, to say the least. His catchphrase involved performing a despicable sex act on the Queen Mother. So I kind of suddenly started to thinking, this is actually an interesting world. It's a more interesting world than I thought. And then I did another open spot at the Meccano Club, the third one, and then Mark said to me, "Can I get you an open spot somewhere else?" And I agreed to that, and then I started to become really nervous, because suddenly, after 4 or 5 accidental gigs, I thought, "Do you know what? I'm really quite enjoying the process of being on stage." I didn't like the process of getting there and the nerves that were starting to escalate, but I actually enjoyed being, and then even better than that, Richard, I'd enjoyed the half an hour after coming off stage. I found I was enjoying more than anything. And then just over the course of a year, I put together a 10-minute set, and then suddenly I was, a regular open spot. But I had a job at the time. I had a really good job. I'd been thrown out of university at the age of 19, which destroyed my mother because I was the only one, the first one in my Irish family to go to university. And I tried to console her with the fact that I was the first one to be thrown out as well. So that was something to be proud of. And I'd found myself via a variety of jobs working for the ambulance service, London Ambulance Service. By this time, I had a really good job in human resources in the ambulance service. I was quite a senior manager. And then suddenly I found myself having to tell off staff who were coming in much later in the morning than I was because I hadn't got home till 3. And then I had a decision to make. I was asked to go and do the Edinburgh Festival to support somebody. And I'd already used my annual leave. So I just decided, I mean, this is the short version of something that took 2 years. So, and then I basically decided that was it. I would leave the job and become a professional full-time stand-up comedian, thus breaking my mum's heart again in the process, to be perfectly honest.
So what sort of year are we talking? What year was this?
I did, I'm almost, it comes as a surprise to me to realise how long ago it was, to be perfectly honest. I mean, look at me. I mean, you're wondering what must the portrait in my attic look like? But I did my first open spot in 1985.
Wow.
And a couple of years after that, myself and James Macabre and Mark Thomas were on the front cover of Time Out, being labelled we were being labelled as a third wave of alternative comedy, which was an honour, but still hadn't quite worked out who the first and second wave was. But I was lucky. It was a time. I think if I'd got interested in comedy a little earlier than that, when it was still just kicking off, I wouldn't have started it. I think if I'd come along a little later than that, when it was becoming the new rock and roll, I probably wouldn't have started off. But I was 20. So I was 20. I just turned 24 when I did my first open spot, which would be considered old now.
I was at Carlisle College in 1985, and then I went to Stoke to do business studies.
Okay, right.
And I came to London in 1992, but my brother was still here.
Yeah.
My brother was here about the late 80s, and that's when I first went to the Comedy Store.
Right.
And the first acts I saw were, the first bill was something like Steve Gribbin, John Maloney was MCing. Phil Jupitus was on it. Linda Smith was on it. Dear old Linda.
God bless her.
Yeah, and top of the bill was somebody called Charles Fleischer, who was this mad American with
I remember he used to tear up
things. Yeah, and he was never heard of again because he went off to voice Roger Rabbit. Yeah, that's where he made his money.
Yeah. So was that
I saw him.
In Stoke, Richard, was that North Staff's Polly?
Yeah.
I did a gig there one night with Nick Hancock. It took us about 3 days to get home because we fell in with some local lads, basically.
Yeah. Well, at college, I saw Ben Elton, I saw Smith and Jones. They were brilliant. They were really good.
Yeah.
So Rowan Atkinson, we saw Julian Clary, we saw, but they were all big names at the time playing theatres in the city. So I lived in Hanley, and I remember there was a record shop there called Mike Lloyd Music, which has long since gone. Yeah. And Rick Mail and Adrian Edmondson were making an appearance there, and you couldn't get in. And I saw him go in and come out again. I saw Rick Mail later on in Carlisle on his own, and he was one of the best gigs I've ever seen. It was extraordinary.
It's interesting you talk about Ben Elton. I like Ben as a person.
Yeah.
But I think he somehow became associated, not with the mainstream, but he was never quite taken as seriously as he should have been because of the whole glittery suit stuff. But he was a fantastic live comedian.
Oh, he was. I mean, when I was at college, you could see him checking his watch for the time he was doing, and it was all about student life. Yeah. And then I saw him again in Carlisle, and it was all about that area of the country. So he was changing his act as he went along, and he was extraordinary. He did about 3 hours. It was amazing. Yeah. But then TV got him, and all the rest of it and whatever. But I think that's how they go. So you've described your first gig, and from that, what do you like to talk about generally on stage? Is there a theme at all, or?
I've always liked to be topical and political where possible. There's a kind of, I'm very proud to have been part of the alternative comedy scene, and I still think of myself as, I always put the alternative in front of comedian still in my own head. But people tend to look back a little bit at it with rose-tinted glasses, because it wasn't all political, topical comedy. We weren't all struggling to bring Thatcher down. It took us 11 years, but we did it in the end. But yeah, you had people like me, you had Jeremy Hardy, Mark Steele, Mark Thomas,
God rest his soul,
Linda Smith again, as you said. But what characterised our circuit was variety, was difference, was, you know, for everybody doing a joke about Thatcher, you had somebody juggling meat, or Randolph the Remarkable diving off a stepladder into a washing up bowl, you know. But the difference was with us that we wrote our own material. That was a big difference. But I was never very good at observational stuff. I was never very good at one-liners. So I always liked to reflect what was going on in the world, and I also liked to talk about what was going on in the world, but through my experience. So, for example, one of the Edinburgh shows that I think you saw when a lot of it was about the NHS, because my wife was being treated. So, but the one thing I've always kind of prided myself, I don't think I've ever told an actual lie on stage. Everything I talk about happened.
Yeah,
right? Now, obviously,
that's fantastic.
But obviously, as a comedian, you exaggerate, you add things to it, you embellish, but everything did happen. You know, so all the, you know, if I say that I was on a demonstration and this happened, then I was on a demonstration, something like that. So that was always something. I always get a bit suspicious, because you think there are some comedians, you think they must spend a lot of time on night buses, because they're meeting a lot of strangers on night buses, these comedians. So not that it doesn't bother me. I mean, of course, comedians are paid liars, but I always prided myself on there being an element of truth, and I also, you know, it was the way I processed things a little bit. It's like if something happened to me, I thought, okay, well, I can either talk to a psychiatrist about this, or I can try and be funny about it on stage. So, but I've always preferred sort of topical. I've always preferred comedy with not a point as such, but I've always preferred there to be a reason for you to be saying something. Just as I've always preferred, really, much as I love. Yeah, I'm partial to a good speciality act, but to be honest, what I really prefer is one person standing in front of a microphone talking about their life. I don't mind how different their life is to mine, but that's the sort of comedy that still I still engage with that more than anything else, to be perfectly honest. Because and that's partly because I can't do anything else. I can't play the guitar, I can't juggle, so I kind of pretend to be slightly sniffy about people who can. But I've always genuinely preferred the one person and the microphone talking about their experience. That's why people like Joe Brand and Linda were so interesting, because they were talking about a female experience that most of us didn't know about. So it's like it was really good to hear, and that's what I like now. I like learning from stand-ups as well. I like learning about different things in life, and I like watching the stand-up and going, I wonder if that's true, and then going to discover it. Yeah, but I've always, so to answer your question, and again, you'll have discovered that you ask a perfectly valid question and I write you an essay. But so
it's brilliant.
So I've always kind of tried to talk about my own life.
It's interesting, because my dad's legacy, God rest his soul, my dad was a union man, and his legacy was he was president of NALGO in 1984.
Was he really?
And then NALGO created Unison, and it was his legacy that Unison came along. And I can remember that we used to go on holidays as a family when I was very small, and the first act I ever saw was Les Dawson at Scarborough.
Wow, really? You saw Les Dawson live?
And then Tommy Cooper as well. It was extraordinary. And I thought, there's something here, and I can remember the whole family laughing at Morecambe and Wise and Christmas and all the rest of it, and I thought I'd love to see them, and I never got a chance to see them.
Well, do you know, that's really, well, first of all, it's really interesting, the NALGO reference, because when I left the ambulance service, I was part of the industrial relations team, part of the negotiating team, and NALGO was one of the unions that we negotiated with, and it's where I first met Jeremy Corbyn, because he was the regional convener of NUPE at the time. So, but that's really interesting, your memories of watching, because if you were to say to me, as you might, who are your favourite, who are the comedians you remember as a kid, the one that stands out for me is Benny Hill, because my dad, but only because my dad loved Benny Hill.
Yeah.
and as a kid, same as Laurel and Hardy, I still love it. And as a kid, you're not entirely sure why your dad's laughing so much, but you think I'm really enjoying being with my dad. Watching him laugh. So you laugh. So it's
part of it. We were a very close family. I lost my mum about 18 months ago.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Thank you. And very close to my brother. And I think we are. I think it's part of it as well, because we all enjoy comedy. My dad was very private, but he would always, if he found something funny, my God, he had a laugh on him.
Really?
I think that's where I got mine from. I always remember we went to see Tom O'Connor at Paynton in the 70s, and I laughed so hard at him it actually floored his act, because he couldn't believe I was laughing so hard. And I thought, thank God for him, I should trademark it. Anyway, it's not about me, it's about you. To date, what has been your worst gig in your long career? I'm amazed you have any bad gigs, because I think you're a very funny man.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. Any comedian, Richard, who tells you that they've never had a bad gig is lying. And in the same way that because I always people often say to me, because I can come across as like modest and self-effacing, and people will often say to my wife, "Oh, the thing I like about Kevin, he hasn't got an ego," and she'll just look at them and go, he very much has got an ego, and it's difficult for Ali now, my wife, because my son's a really good comedian now as well. So when we could still perform live, Ali's nightmare was that we would both turn up at the same time after a gig full of testosterone, just telling her how good we'd gone. But the ego comes into it, because in the first 2 years of being a comic, none of us are very good. But still we get up on stage and insist that we can perform to strangers until we become good. But I do remember my worst gig, because it kind of really derailed me in a sense, because that period I've told you about, when the first sort of year, 18 months, when it was all coming, not easily, but people were asking me to do stuff. And my first open spot at Jongleurs, and I grew to love performing at Jongleurs later on. I really used to love performing at Jongleurs, because yes, it was a yuppie paradise, but I found you could talk about anything there as long as you were funny, basically. But my first open spot there, the first 2 minutes was fine, but then it just started to drift off, and I couldn't get it back. And it was my first experience of that actually happening. And of course, it was by far the biggest audience I'd ever had. 300 people was like almost 10 times as many people as I'd performed in, and it was horrible. It really was horrible. And I still remember there's a comic now, I won't name him, but he's still a household name, who was quite spectacularly cruel to me afterwards.
Wow.
Really unsympathetic, because it's a very long walk into the dressing room when you've not done very well. But the odd thing is that I learned from it, because the guy, John Davey, the guy who ran Jongleurs, he'd given me 2 open spots. He said, "I want you to do the second one." But he just said to me, "Look, your problem is," and he was absolutely right. He said, because I used to stand in front of the microphone and it looked like I was reading an autocue in my own head. I didn't engage with the audience. I looked straight ahead a bit, the way Steve Punt used to do with looks. So I used to look straight ahead, and it looked like I was reading the inside of my own eyelids, as though and that was fine in a small room with 30 people. But at Jongleurs, when half the audience could only see the side of you and you weren't turning, he said, once you lost them, you're never going to get them back. So that was a really salutary lesson, and it's probably still my worst experience, because it's.
But I think because every comedian has to go through that, it makes them a better comedian if they have a bad gig.
It does, and I'm not going to pretend that's the only awkward gig I had, because we all have gigs that you should never have. They're normally corporates. You all have gigs that you should never have taken, but it's it was a salutary lesson, and it did change the way I performed. But it probably took me 6 months for the lesson to fall in, because also I also realised that I was going to have to go through another difficult year to get good. I realised how far behind the rest of the comedy circuit I was, because there's a magic moment as a comedian. The first time when you don't get a laugh and it doesn't bother you is a magic moment. The first time you don't get a laugh, but you get a laugh by acknowledging that you didn't get a laugh. So it's like now on stage, if I don't get a laugh, I'm perfectly happy, because then I will just berate the audience for not getting the joke. But that's a brilliant thing to learn. Once you can show the audience that you're not terrified, even if you are terrified, once you can show that you're not, that's a brilliant place. That's when you're starting to arrive as a comic. That's when you look like you're completely in charge, even though inside the alarm bells are ringing, you're scrambling around. Every instinct is to get out of there, but you're still just, and that's a good moment. But that was a lonely night. It was a horrible night. But as you say, we all have to go through that to become better comedians. There's no doubt about that.
It's interesting because the blog obviously celebrates all the comedians that I go and watch, and I love the experience of it. I hope I'm passionate about it, and the whole thing is wonderful. But one year, I've told this to many a comedian, and one year I got it out my system, and I thought I've got to have a go at stand-up comedy. And I was at the Edinburgh Fringe, and I knew the bloke who run the free Fringe, and he said, he said, go on a Monday afternoon to the Haymarket. There's a gig with old folk in the crowd. It's a gong show, and have you got a script? And I'd written this script about me crashing cars in Carlisle because I was never a very good driver. And he said, oh yeah, that's really funny. And I walked out. There was 3 people in the crowd. And I walked out, and the first line was, hello, ladies and gentlemen. People think I look like Eddie the Eagle Edwards, but I can't see the resemblance myself. And one old bloke at the back just went, fuck off, and gonged me off. So the promoter went, have another go. So the same thing happened. And I thought, no. And I said to him, never say never again. But my place is in the audience, supporting everybody. I call them fearless heroes who have to go out and do this, and it's wonderful I love watching. You're a classic example of somebody develop, because I first saw Harry Hill 30 years ago, and he's still going, and on and on and on, How do you remember all your routines when you're on stage?
Do you know what, Rich? That's a really interesting question. A couple of Edinburghs ago, I was chatting to a friend of mine, an actor, and I told him about, and this is true, this is an ambition. I said, look, one day I would love to play some of the smaller comedy Shakespeare roles. I'd love to play Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing, or I'd love to play Andrew, or the Shepherd in the Winter's Tale. And he said, why don't you? I said, well, I just can't get dialogue and speeches in my head. I can't remember them. He said, but I've just seen you do a 75-minute monologue, essentially, and it's an interesting, because I can't remember. I love to quote Shakespeare, but I'm out after the first line. I can't remember. Wow. It's the same as song lyrics. I remember that. Yeah. It is. I know the first 2 lines of millions of songs, but beyond that, I can't remember the rest of them. And I think I don't know what the process is. I think what it is as well is it doesn't matter if a comedian forgets his lines in the same way that an actor does, because if an actor forgets his lines, it derails the whole play, and an actor can't go from to be or not to be. Is this a dagger I see before me? Because the audience are going to go, hang on, he's just got 2 plays mixed up then. Because if you're doing an Edinburgh show and you kind of go, oh, hang on, what's next? You can either say to the audience, do you know what, I really can't remember what's next.
Yeah.
And make a laugh about it. Or you can go on to something and then come back to it. But with me, I find it, because I like to structure my shows, because I always like, God, I mean, how Tim Vine can remember 121, because they're all in the right order as well. How Tim Vine can do that, I don't know. But because once I've started, I know pretty much where I'm going, if you see what I mean. I know the kind of route map, and I can meander my way through it and take detours, but I know that I will get back. and because I like to structure, one thing normally leads to another. So I kind of know where I'm going. So I've never struggled with retaining my own set, and because I always, again, I don't believe a lot of comics who say I just turn up at the venue, I get up on stage, I say the first thing that comes into my head. I genuinely don't believe them. I think there might be one or two people that have got a kind of jazz musician mind who can do that, but I can't do that. I have to have 5 pieces of paper. It's like
I think it's
2 days.
I think it's interesting,
say, Richard, yeah,
because if you're writing your own stuff, you may remember it because it's a play. It's somebody else's words.
I think that's a very good point, because and also because it's your own stuff, you've got the right to mess with it as much as you want when you do it, because it's interesting. I think most comics would admit the best things they write happen on stage when the synapses are going and the energy's going, and you say something, and in your head you go, actually I'm going to add this, and then you go home and you write it down then. But what in terms of preparation, it's like you saw me on that Zoom gig recently. I have to start 2 nights before, and like I will write what I'm going to say. I'll think, right, what's the new stuff I'm going to do? What's the stuff I'm going to do about the situation? What's that? And I'll do a kind of running order, and then over the next day I'll whittle that down to just a number of headings, basically. But if I don't do that process, I panic before I go on stage. I need to do that. Like Hattie Hayridge always used to write her set out completely. She would write the whole set out completely before she went on stage. Otherwise, she couldn't do it. And I genuinely think all comics, because it's the professional thing to do. You should be preparing. You shouldn't just be turning up on stage going, right, let's see what's going to happen. Because for the most part, if you do that, nothing happens. I find, it's every now and again, if I'm comparing a benefit, I might sort of relax a little bit and just go, right, I'll say hello and then see what happens, because it doesn't matter so much because I'm comparing. But if I'm doing a set or a show, I always need a structure, and that structure helps me to remember what I'm going to say. And as you say as well, because once you're experienced like I am and you've got a lot of material to fall back on, it's like you kind of go, if you trust your mind a little bit, because you think, well, if I forget one bit, my mind will shunt another bit in and I can come back to it. Do you know what I mean? So it's, and again, audiences don't mind, especially once you've been doing it as long as I have, and audiences kind of know you, they kind of don't mind if you say, oh God, Grandad's forgotten what he's supposed to be saying again. Do you know what I mean? It's like, but it isn't, it's terrifying for a young, when you first start, that notion of not, and sometimes you can be too structured. Without doubt, I was too structured when I started. Like I said, that auto cue thing is like, if I forgot one word, I was completely thrown. I had no idea what to do next. So there's a happy medium, and I think I hope I found it anyway now after 30.
Definitely, mate. Yeah. The reason I asked the question is that the most creative thing I've done, other than this blog, was write a play for the Edinburgh Fringe.
Oh wow, brilliant!
It was going to be for the Edinburgh Fringe, but I've never pitched it there. We raised a lot of money for Comic Relief. We put 3 shows on. The play was called The Applicant, and it was basically about, it's me, but under another name, who's from Carlisle, moves down to London, has a successful girlfriend, but he can't get a job. And every scene is me in the waiting room, and then me being interviewed by the interviewer for the job. So when I run out, I've got the audience, and I start nervously looking at them and start going with a monologue which sets up the story. And of course, the first night after all the rehearsals, I forgot the monologue.
Oh no, really?
So there's something about writing words down as opposed to it not off the cuff, but you need to steer yourself to a point, I think, and there's fair case for that as well. But it's fascinating. It's fascinating. Let's move on to Edinburgh itself. I've seen you many times in the Pleasance Courtyard for a beer, just wandering around. I go to the Edinburgh Festival. I'm very lucky. I go there every year. I've been going there since 2005, and I see about 50 shows in a week. I absolutely love it. What was your first Edinburgh Fringe like?
Well, can I say, Richard, that we love people like you. No, seriously, we love people like you that have the same enthusiasm for it. That I sometimes get a bit cross with comedians, with mates of mine who they'll go to Edinburgh, and you'll say to them, you'll bump into them at 1 o'clock in the morning, and you'll say, "What have you been to see?" And they go, "Nothing." I go, "What do you mean nothing?" And I say, "You're in the middle of the biggest arts festival in the world. Half of it is free, and you've been to see nothing. You have to embrace it. You really have to embrace it." And if I missed Edinburgh so much.
So have I.
I so missed it. I didn't think I would, because it was the first Edinburgh in 25 years that I hadn't been at all in any capacity whatsoever. Because even if I'm not doing a show, and I didn't do a show for a long time, I still had a reason to go up there, whether I was directing someone or working with someone, or just to watch some of Ali's shows, or just to go there, because I couldn't not be there. And I hope, I describe myself as agnostic rather than religious, but if there is a heaven, it will be the Pleasance Courtyard at
you and me both.
3 o'clock on a sunny afternoon, just when you're just bumping into loads of people, and you just go with the flow, and you just talk bollocks about comedy and about all day. But I remember going to Edinburgh for the first time, and rather bizarrely, this is why I had to leave the ambulance service, because I got asked to support. This is how things were in those days. So this was 18. I got asked to support a Danish feminist double act who didn't know who I was, and I didn't know who they were. And it was in an old gymnasium, and I got a lift up there with a mate. And when I got there, I discovered that they'd both gone back to Denmark, because these Danish feminists found out that one of their boyfriends had been sleeping with the other one. So I found myself in Edinburgh not having a show to do. So I kind of wandered around for a week, because I was staying on the next floor. But I'd never seen anything like it.
Oh, it's extraordinary.
I'd never seen anything like. And bear in mind that then Edinburgh was tiny, and then the next year I did a show with the Nice People, Phil Clark and Simon Godley.
Yeah.
With them and Nick Hancock, and then I did a show with Joe Brand and Michael Redmond, which was at the Gilded Bloom, which was brilliant. And then I did a show with John Maloney, which was brilliant. And then in 1991, I did my first full Edinburgh show, and I remember, and I was at the Pleasance, and I was in the third venue at the Pleasance. I was in it was the first upstairs, and people were moaning then about the Pleasance having 3 venues. They're going, "This has gone too far. It's gone mad. 3 venues in one place." But yeah, I think it's about 27 now. But I remember getting off the train, and I remember going to my flat and seeing my poster. I don't think I've ever felt prouder in my life.
That's brilliant.
It's so exciting, and it was just feeling, because by then I was totally in love with comedy. I was just totally obsessed with it. I couldn't believe my luck that I'd found myself in this brilliant world, being creative, enjoying it with people that I still love now, and just being part of the Edinburgh Festival. I mean, because I'd heard of the Edinburgh Festival, I knew about it, mainly you'd heard about Beyond the Fringe and things like that, but to suddenly be part of the Edinburgh Festival, and the first show I did, there were 6 people in, and 3 of them, it turned out, were reviewers, right? And it was a brilliant show, and it got really good. So by the end of it, I was selling out, albeit in a small room. And so then every year, Edinburgh became the focal point. You just wrote, the whole year spent writing to Edinburgh, and I did 7 one-man shows in a row.
Wow.
And I probably shouldn't have done the last one. I probably should have had a couple of years off, but then I got sidetracked by other stuff, and then it was a long time before I went back with a full-length show. But I always went back, and for me, it's almost impossible to explain. It's like explaining football to someone who doesn't get football. You can't explain what the Fringe Festival is like until you've experienced it, and it's just discovering. I remember one of the first years I was there, second year did a one-man show, and I was walking down the Royal Mile, and it was my day off. I was walking down the Royal Mile, and this young girl was about 16 or 17, obviously young, gave me a leaflet for the Leicestershire Youth Theatre production of Midsummer Night's Dream. She said, "Would you like to see this show?" And I just thought, might as well. And it was brilliant. It was young people's theatre, but it was brilliant. Yeah. So I went back the next 4 years to see whatever they were doing.
Yeah.
I just love the fact
the amount of discoveries are extraordinary.
And half of them you're getting in for nothing, or you're paying £3. It's like you pay £3 a night. If it's no good, you've lost £3. But I get really cross with and you know who I'm talking about. Older comics who get really bitter and chippy about younger comics coming through, or younger performers coming through, as though it's binary, as though every new person that comes through means an old one has to disappear. It's not like that.
No.
And I love, partly because of Ed's, my son's generation, I love mentoring people. I do a lot of it on TV shows. I love mentoring new writers, new comedians, because it keeps me involved in the circuit. But walking down the Royal Mile, and yeah, you can either laugh at all these enthusiastic kids, all right, and yes, some of them are middle class, fine, it is what it is. You can either laugh at all these kids who are full of energy and full of life and full of enthusiasm, or you can just go, oh, brilliant, this is fantastic. But you can either get bitter about it and say, "Oh, bugger off that to Cambridge, you little punks," or you can just go, "What is it you're doing? Tell me about your show." And you've got to do that, because that energy, walking down the Royal Mile, that energy is fantastic. Going to see a comedian you've never seen before, you've only heard about, and just go, "Oh, mate, she's good," or "He's good," you know.
Well, the amount of comedians that I saw in huts play about 20 people and are now massive. We're talking Michael McIntyre, we're talking Sarah Millican, we're talking Russell Howard. It's extraordinary. But then you've got, we always go and see Arthur Smith, we always go and see Barry Cryer. Barry Cryer, I wish I'd got a photograph with him, but I met him twice, and I went up to him and I shook his hand. He was having something to eat, and we waited until he was finished eating, and he came over and I shook his hand and I said, "We're such big fans of you." And he looked at me and he grinned and he said, "You're the ones." What a lovely man, and he's hilarious.
But Barry's, there's been a couple of Edinburghs where I can only go up for like 3 days, and I'll always make sure it's a day that Barry's doing his show with Ronnie Golden, because it always makes me laugh. Steve Gunnithorne is a brilliant producer and photographer. As you know, he looks after Barry's shows, and he always says to me, "Because I will sit and listen to Barry all night, right? Yeah. And I don't care if Barry's telling me the same things he's told me the year before, but because this is a man who's worked with everybody. Exactly. He's worked with Bob Hope. Yeah. He's worked with everybody. I'm perfect. I'm obsessed with the history of comedy. Barry can tell me what he wants." And I remember one night, it was only about 2 or 3 years ago. In fact, it was a roast for his 80th birthday.
Yeah, I was there.
Which was a brilliant night. And then afterwards, we were all in the loft drinking, and Steve Gunnithorne said to me, "Look, Barry's driving me up the wall. He just keeps telling the same stories. So I've come up with a word. Right? I'm going to say the code word is banana. If Barry launches into a story he's already told, I'm going to say banana." So, and then brilliantly, we're all sitting around, and Barry launched into a story, and Steve Gunnithorne said, "Barry, banana," and Barry went, "Did I ever tell you about the Irishman and the parrot and the banana?" And I was like, he's great, Barry. He's one. Arthur again is one of the. I'm very.
Arthur's been on this, and he was wonderful.
I'm very proud of my association with Arthur over the years. Ali, my wife, she stage managed every show that
I was going to say
Arthur did, and she was in one of the singers in the Smithereens.
Yeah.
And I'm very, and just Arthur's.
Oh, he's wonderful.
His attitude to his attitude to Edinburgh in particular, and it's just like he's. And sometimes, there's a touch of the Barry cries about Arthur sometimes. When you're trying to rehearse with Arthur, it's like when I write and direct with Arthur, like Sid was a brilliant show. It's like trying to keep a kitten in a basket. His attention span is so short. I mean, you'd be going, "Look, we need to get. We've got 2 days before Edinburgh. The show we've got to sort it out." But it's like, but somehow it always comes good. But I love. It takes longer to get away from an Arthur show in Edinburgh than any other show, because his audience.
Well, he's been going for years and years.
But also because his audience as well, because Sid was about his father. Half the people in the audience would want to share memories of their father.
Yeah, exactly.
And Arthur's only too happy to do that. But it's like I seriously, I get very emotional about Edinburgh. I think it looks, touch wood, as though there will be a festival of sorts this year. And I think it will be smaller, and I don't think there'll be any acts from overseas, but there will be a festival. But I won't truly believe all this is over until I walk into the Pleasance Courtyard.
Exactly. You and me both, mate. Yeah. I first saw your solo shows, Standy Uppy in 2014 and Hairline in 2015 at the Fringe, which I both thought were brilliant, and it was wonderful to see you. tell me about how you get your ideas for shows.
Well, I came, to be honest, I got the idea of doing the first one, Standing Uppy, from John Richardson,
right?
Indirectly, because it had been over a decade since my last full-length Edinburgh show, because I got sidelined, distracted, whatever word you want to use, by TV writing and by other stuff. And so I just hadn't had the time to come up with a new Edinburgh show. I didn't want to go back to Edinburgh unless I had a really good show, and I hadn't the time to write one. And I was working with John Richardson and Matt Ford on 8 out of 10 Cats.
Yeah.
And I love both of them. I love Matt Ford to bits.
Yeah, superb.
He's but again, it's like working with a hyperactive toddler. It's like, don't give him sugar, whatever you do.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of John Richardson. And we were just chatting one afternoon, and Ramesh Ranganathan came in. So we're all chatting. I'm much older than these lads. It doesn't bother me a bit. They asked me questions about the Blitz, and I asked them when was the last time they had an Appy change. That sort of relationship. But I love working with John. John takes comedy very seriously.
Yeah.
We were chatting, and then, oddly enough, one of them, I can't remember who, had just got a new passport, and we were talking about passports. And John said to me, "What does it say on your passport?" And I said, "It says comedian." And he said, "But you don't do shows. You haven't done any." I said, "Well, I do. Of course, I do shows. I do benefits." He said, "Well, you're not doing one. When can I come and see you next?" I was like, "Well, 6 weeks." And I suddenly realised there was a whole generation of comics who knew me by reputation and respected my reputation, but had never seen me. So I kind of thought, I've got to go back and prove to these youngsters.
And by God, you did.
Well, I'm pleased I did, because I remember Fordy and Ramesh came and they all came, and it's like I had to look them in the eye, because it's like I loved working with them. They knew that I was good to work with, and I was obviously a very good writer, and I was able to help them. But I wanted to be, because if somebody says to me, "What do you do for a living?" I always say comedian. That's the thing I'm most proud of. All the things I've done, all the broadcasting, all the writing books, all that stuff. But in my head, I'm a comedian. I'm a stand-up comedian. That's what I do. So it was brilliant to go back to Edinburgh for 3 weeks as a stand-up comedian. And as it happened, my wife had not long before the festival been diagnosed with what we thought was terminal illness, and thank God, the NHS saw her through it, and she's fine, and the prognosis is fine. She's great, but it's just, I thought, that's the thing that's been occupying my mind almost completely. So I've got to talk about that. I've got to talk about the fact that that's how, again, as I talked about earlier, I process serious stuff through humour. I've got to talk about this. So I knew it was going to be structured around that. And then basically it was it was also, well, I've got plenty of ideas. I've been it for a long time, so I've got plenty of ideas. Can I find a theme? And then I found that I couldn't fit the ideas to the theme, so I just wrote a completely new show. And it wasn't really about anything. I just so loved the process of going back and doing Edinburgh previews and doing tryout nights, going to places like Old Rope. And these are things I hadn't done for a long time. And I found again that the stuff was writing itself on stage. I found that I would have an idea, and I'd phone up Tiff Stevenson and say, "Can I come down and try this out?" She'd say, "Of course you can." And I would try it out. But I found that whilst I was on stage, I was having other ideas, and I was going home and then writing them down. So it was brilliant. So I can't, apart from the NHS thing, I can't really pretend that I had an idea for the show, that there was a theme for the spoofing
from the experience of doing
it. Basically, and then I thought, right, I've got to go back. There's no point just doing it once, so I've got to go back next year. And then in the meantime, my mum died in the meantime, so I thought, well, I'm going to have to write about this notion that my wife got better, but my mum died. And there was a lot of Catholic Protestant issues around my mum dying, because I'm from a mixed religious family, and I still struggle now with the Anglo-Irish part of my identity. So I thought, well, okay, you're old enough now. You've never spoken about it before. Let's talk about that now. But I was just so excited about being alive, just brilliant, being alive, stand up again, and because I love my friends dearly, and a lot of my memories are about football. I can't wait to see my closest mates who are all from school and from early work days.
Brilliant.
I love them dearly, but there's nowhere better on God's earth I'd rather be than the dressing room in a comedy venue with other comics.
Yeah.
It's just a wonderful place to be, and just reminding myself of that. Just the love of showing off. I can't put it any other way than the love of showing off. I could.
It's such a drug to watch it. It must be amazing to perform it.
Well, I'm pleased to hear you say that, because I could lie and say, look, I've got important things to say. The world needs to know my view on this, but there is an element of that. But no, it's essentially, I've forgotten how brilliant it is.
Wonderful thing.
Well, also getting that because I suffered from quite bad stage. That first show, I got really bad stage fright the week beforehand, to the extent that I had to talk to somebody about the anxiety I was feeling about getting back on stage and doing an error. But I'd forgotten how brilliant that 5 minutes was after coming off stage, and that any stage fright before it's worth the 7-8 hours stage fright beforehand for that hour afterwards. So it was just brilliant to be part of the comedy scene again.
Yeah. You've written for, amongst others, Joe Brand and Dave Allen. Tell me the differences of writing for other comedians, because there's a section in my blog called The Ones That Got Away, and Dave Allen was one who I would have loved to have seen and never did. I was a massive fan.
It's how many comics listen to the blog?
Well, I've got about 80,000 hits.
Right, which is brilliant, because I want to be honest with. There's no. Working with Dave Allen was a slightly different experience, because when Dave did his last ITV set, and Dave was somebody I would happily say was a comedy idol. I was aware that Dave Allen was different when I was growing up, because he sat down for a start and he told long form stories rather than jokes. And I was aware as a youngster that he really, really upset my mother, who was a proper saber rattling Catholic. Right. And he really made my dad, who was not religious at all, he really made my dad laugh. And one of my memories of Dave, who was the most fantastic, interesting, and occasionally curmudgeonly bloke, was that when my mum and dad came to see one of the recordings, my mum was a big drinker, as Dave was at times, and my mum was just going to tear it. She went, well, I'm going to come, but I will sit there stony-faced, and afterwards I'm going to tell him exactly what I think about his nonsense about the poet. And of course he charmed her out of the trees, and 2 hours later we had to drag him out. But the writing for Dave was Dave didn't need anyone writing for him, but it just so happened that he did this last series at ITV. He hated ITV. He didn't like it at all. But they said to him, you've got to get a couple of younger people in, a couple more relevant people. Yeah. He didn't like that idea, but Mark Thomas and I were with the same agency, and we met, and he liked us, and he said, fine, but you don't write for Dave Allen. It's preposterous, the idea that you write for Dave Allen. You're with him, and you might occasionally say, have you heard of this thing called the internet? Why don't you write about that? But you can't write for him. And there's one morning when he came in and said, I've been working on this routine about telling the time and teaching the time to a kid. And Mark and I, left-wing firebrand comedians, Mark and I kind of looked at each other and went, good luck with that, Grandad. And of course, it's one of the most brilliant routines. But having said that, I loved writing for Joe. I've written for other comics. I was still write, or rather, I was script edit for other comics, because it's not the same. Ideally, most comics don't really want other comics writing for them, and most comics don't really want to write for other comics because I don't think I'm very good at finding other people's voices. I'm very good at writing in people's voices, which is fine if you're writing for the host of I Got News for You, and it's fine if you're writing stand-up. But Joe's experience of life, we might be a similar age, but her experience of life is so different to mine that it's kind of preposterous to expect me to write jokes about her being the victim of sexist attacks or about women's health problems and mental health. And of course you write that, but I don't think you ever fully 100% commit when you're writing stuff for other people, because you lose control of it, because there's also that thing, you come up with an idea, you think of something, or you write with someone, and you kind of go, oh God, I'd rather do that. I think that suits me better than it suits him or them or her. And there's this reluctance, and there's nothing worse. I love working on Have I Got News For You, but there's nothing worse than seeing a joke that you've loved, that's gone through the whole process, being completely mangled by some American actor who hasn't got a clue. Do you know? And it's a frustrating performance, because it comes back to what I talked about, Richard, about showing off. It's like, I want to be the one showing off. And it's like, yes, there's a satisfaction if somebody gets a laugh on stage from a joke. There's a couple of lines in Sid, Arthur Smith's last Edinburgh thing. There's a couple of lines in that, quite a few lines in that I wrote, and that's brilliant. But it's not the same as getting your own, really isn't the same as getting your own laugh. So it's a frustrating experience. I mean, it's always different if you're. It's like with John Richardson, for example, working with him. Or working with Sarah Millican was a brilliant process on her TV shows. Yeah. Myself and Jeff Norcott, and a few others would there'd be like 3 or 4 of us with Sarah, and essentially what you did was you just chatted the whole day, basically. Whatever the theme was, you just chatted the whole day, and then one of the people from the office would literally write everything down, would type everything down, and at the end of the evening, Sarah would take the iPad with her and go to a local comedy club, and she would read out the stuff on the iPad, basically, and then she'd make a note. So that was a completely different experience. Different way of doing it. And like workshopping stuff with John Richardson, or there were times when Joe Brand and I would just like chat about ideas. That's brilliant. That's a process I really enjoy. But actually filling a blank sheet of paper for another comic it just isn't as satisfying as writing stuff.
It's amazing. If you think of somebody like Eddie Braben having to do it for Morecambe and Wise, it nearly killed him.
Well, I'm not surprised as well, because that's the genius of Morecambe and Wise. And I'm like you. I envy the fact you saw Les Dawson live. And
I saw him twice. He was brilliant.
Morecambe and Wise now for me are still.
They're still brilliant.
Although my dad still insists it was Ernie that was the funny one. But
wow.
Of course. But when you're watching it as a kid, when you're watching these Christmas specials with your parents, it doesn't occur to you that they're not making this stuff up as they go along. It doesn't occur to you because I don't think anybody was better than Eric Morecambe and Ernie Wise at delivering other people's stuff as though they just thought of it off the top of their head. It's like almost like watching Eddie Izzard. You think this stuff is spontaneous, and as a kid you don't really know about the recording process. But for Eddie Braben to have to write that week in, week out,
it nearly killed him.
He famously said, and of course there was that famous occasion that when he heard Eric on a TV show saying that Eddie. Get it right. Eddie helped them with the writing, and so just sent in a blank piece of paper for the next week's script. I mean, it's an art form to interpret. That's where Tony Hancock was a genius, but he wasn't satisfied with interpreting Galton and Simpson's words, and because it didn't occur to him that he couldn't do it himself. Whereas Eric and Ernie knew they couldn't do it themselves. But again, I don't know how Eddie Braben would do that. I mean.
He used to write initially for Ken Dodd, didn't he? And so
I did back in the day. Yeah, well, and funny enough, I met. I think it was Dick. I can't remember if it was Dick Hills. I don't know if you saw this show in Edinburgh a couple of years back, the Morecambe and Wise show. John, which was brilliant, and I can't remember if it's Sid or Dick, whichever one of them was. Eric and Ernie's first ITV writers came to the show one afternoon, and he wasn't particularly happy afterwards because, of course, it focused on the Eddie Braben years, but. All I can say is Eddie Braben's ego must have been incredible, because for him to stand there, to have all the fear and the worry of Eric not getting laughs, and then none of the praise. I don't see how you could do that.
Couldn't do that.
How could you? I simply couldn't do that, because that's the only one of the downsides on working on shows that Have I Got News For You is you never get thanked for lines that get a massive laugh, but you'll always get blamed for lines that don't get a laugh.
Wow.
And it's just one of those things you put up with. But then because you want to say, well, hang on a second, it would have got a laugh if I said it.
We got into Have I Got News for You once, and nobody knew who it was going to be, and it was the first time Bruce Forsyth was on it.
Oh my God, really?
It was one of the best recordings I've ever been to. I'm actually on video forevermore with my laugh, because when he's trying to read something, and he goes da 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 da, and I am crying, and he looks around and he looked at me and he went, "Please, this is autocue. This is satire." That was the line.
He was. We were all. I wouldn't say we were worried about it, but it was a very different booking, and the BBC insisted on him doing it for various reasons. I'm not entirely sure he was nervous about the reaction
because he hadn't been on TV for a while.
He was very wary, and it was before Strictly came back. He was very wary. But my abiding memory of the afternoon, because I got to know Bruce because I wrote on a couple of series of Strictly. I was a secret writer on Strictly Come Dancing because Rob Colley was wearing himself out coming up with tutu puns, so they got me into help. So I've got this abiding memory of sitting in the dressing room with Bruce, who just had his vest on, and he had sock suspenders on, which I've never seen before. But again, Bruce Forsyth is another one of those people. It's like Bob Monkhouse. I'll listen to Bruce all evening. This is Bruce Forsyth you talk about. But I remember in the afternoon in the rehearsal for Have I Got News for You, when Bruce came out to check the stuff on the auto cue, and Bruce is going, and he said, "Can it get any bigger?" And the auto cue guy went, "Okay," and it got bigger. And eventually the auto cue guy went, "It doesn't get any bigger." That's the biggest. He said, "It's one word per screen at the moment," because that's literally, because it was literally. But then Brucey came out, and
he was superb.
But there's a moment, and you can clock it on the show, and you could certainly clock it in the night, because everybody turned up to see this show. I don't know if you noticed that to the side of the studio, it was rammed because everybody associated with the show wanted to see it. Yeah. There's a moment when Bruce comes on, and he clocks the reception he's getting, and you can see he gets a little bit emotional because the audience went completely batshit bonkers when they saw Bruce Forsyth, and he was just.
I was there.
but you remember what he was like as well. He just played with it all night.
He was extraordinary. I mean, they wheeled the curtains out, and he did the strongman pose, and he was away. Let me in my audience.
Oh, but that's exactly what he was like. I've saw when he used to do his own warm up for Strictly.
Wow.
So he would do an hour before the show started.
Wow.
And the audience loved it, and they loved him. Yeah.
I saw him for his 70th at the Palladium, and he was extraordinary. He did 3 hours, and he just sung and danced and everything. Yeah. We're running out of time, unfortunately. I could talk to you all night. I really enjoyed it. I just want to ask you one more thing, because one or two more things. One of my comedy heroes who I never saw live was Bob Monkhouse. He was a fantastic comedian, and when BBC 4 showed Bob Monkhouse The Last Stand, there you were in the audience. Did you play a major part in getting that show together?
No, not at all. No. Not at all. It was only 6 months before he died.
Yes,
I'm still. It came out of the blue. I love Bob Monkhouse. I met Bob. One of my first TV sort of panel things Bob was on, and we got on well. And again, I think he liked the fact that I just wanted to hear him talk about the old days, and he was very kind to me. He was very, very generous in a way that a lot of his generation of comics were very challenged by us as comedians. He wasn't. Barry Cryer was another one. Bob wanted to welcome new comics, and he said it reminded him of when he was a young comic. And Bob, what people need to know about Bob, and I always used to say this about him, it's always he's smarmy, he's slick, he's this. And yes, he probably was as a game show host, but as a stand-up, when you see his stand-up shows, my God, what a brilliant stand-up comedian he was. And he showed me some footage of stuff that he'd done in the 60s and 70s at working men's clubs, which was quite political. I wouldn't say it was filth, but it was adult. And he was a brilliant stand-up. And I'm really pleased that he was so pleased that towards the end of his life, people started to rediscover. He got the recognition he deserved. But the invitation to, so it's 2003, I think, the invitation came totally out of the blue, and it was I had a phone call from my agent saying this production company said, "Will you come and be in the audience?" And it's like, of course I was, and I'm still really proud, because on the show, the first thing Bob says as he comes out of the dressing room is he says hello to me.
Yeah,
is my friend, which is I'm still really proud of that now. And it's amazing. Every time it gets repeated, I get umpteen. And by sheer coincidence, Ali, my wife, was looking after him that day, and she told me beforehand how poorly he was. But the reason we got invited was that he'd had this idea for a new series for BBC One, and BBC One said to him, "Look, well, here's 50 quid, do a live pilot in a pub or whatever you want to do." And the idea was that Bob would rediscover some of his comedy heroes. So on that show, he had Mike Yarwood on.
I was just going to say,
as a guest, and Mike Yarwood was very nervous and clearly had been drinking. And the interview was fine, but Mike Yarwood didn't have the same cachet with us as an audience as Bob. So it wasn't a problem. So Bob decided to add some value to the night by doing this hour-long stand-up thing, which again was a tour de force. So it's and then sadly it's only 6 months later that we realised how ill Bob was. It's the last time he performed live, and it's I wouldn't say it's a star-studded audience, but there's a lot of recognisable people in the audience, and it was the most remarkable night. But none of us realised, Richard, how significant it was to become, because none of us realised, if we knew it was his last gig, we would never have let him leave the stage. Do you know what I mean? But we didn't know that. We knew he was ill because he told us, but we didn't know that he only had months to live. And so it became significant in later years. And of course, it's become a kind of cult TV show now. But there was a remarkable atmosphere on the night. But again, I just enjoyed being in the company of other comedians. Yeah. Just relaxing and enjoying. And also because Bob he could be quite naughty. And there was a few people who'd been invited that hadn't turned up. Jonathan Ross was one of them, and Bob just told us some very funny Jonathan Ross joke, and it was like, because he was quite mischievous, but his technique was amazing. Because he's one of those. What I found interesting about it, Richard, is that comedians are a terrible audience. You don't really want. I love watching comedians, but I don't laugh because but we don't tend to, because you're kind of second guessing what you are, but you're kind of going, where's she going with this joke, or you're kind of thinking about how you would do it, and then afterwards you say to people, that was brilliant, I really enjoyed it, and they say, you didn't crack a fucking smile. But that night with Bob, to watch an audience, it wasn't all comedians, there were other people from the business, but watching an audience of comedians just giving themselves up to the laughter was brilliant, and it was a special night, but it's become more special since, I have to say. On the night it was brilliant, but since it's become significant.
It was, in my view, it was an everlasting tribute to him, because it proved. I loved the bit that he did the comedy, and then he started talking about his favourite comedians. And then he had the interview, and so it was all structured without really knowing.
That's interesting, because he started telling us, again, this was because the interview hadn't gone as well as for as long as he wanted, and he started telling us, and there were two versions, because originally after Bob died, his wife insisted on a couple of cuts to the documentary because she didn't want him to appear unkind, which he wasn't. He teased some people, but he wasn't unkind. But he started telling us about his relationship with Peter Sellers and Peter Sellers' mother, and he told us halfway through this that this was the first time he'd said it out loud. So we're all kind of going, "Holy mother of God, this is quite." But I think I'm glad you think it's a thing, because it's really good. Had he died 5 years earlier, he probably wouldn't have been dismissed. But his knowledge of comedy, not just his generation of comedy, but I think it's a matter of record now that he taped everything that was on TV. He kept every TV time, and he knew. And again, that was another thing in one of the documentaries about his books. There was a close up of a little cartoon he did of me and one of my jokes, which is like brilliant. But he knew. So it turned out that all the people in the audience, all the comedians, he'd asked for them especially. And we only found that out at the end of the night. We just thought it was a random list of people at the BBC, but he'd asked for especially. So I was very proud of that, because for all that I started by talking about alternative comedy and how proud I am of alternative comedy, I'm also very proud to be part of the history of, like musical and Beyond the Free, all that sort of thing. I'm proud to be somewhere on that list of people. So that
it's so well deserved, because you are a great comedian. I always look forward when your name's on a bill, or when we're going to see a show. I know I'm going to have a great time, and I laugh consistently at you.
Oh well, thank you, Richard. That's kind.
I think it's great. I've so much enjoyed tonight. Is there anything else you'd like to say before you go? Are you writing any shows? Where can people find you online?
Not really. You'll see me. I always think it's a bit tawdry to end with. This is you can listen to my podcast on Apple. The one thing I will say, have I got an interview starts back soon, and then League of the one thing you will be able to see more of me after, when all this is over, I will be doing much more. I want to get into theatre stuff, as I mentioned earlier, but I'm going to be doing much more live work. I've missed it. I've missed it so much. The performing. I've done a lot of quiz stuff on Zoom and podcast stuff on Zoom, but that gig you saw me a couple of weeks ago was the only gig I've done on Zoom, and I was buzzing for about an hour afterwards, just been out to see an audience. But so I will end by saying, Richard, that I've spoken to comics who have done this before, and obviously, I've spoken to Jay, because you're always there in the front row, and we genuinely appreciate the support of people like you. It means a lot to know that it means a lot to people. Really, it means a lot to know that we're not just whistling in the dark. Because I'm passionate about comedy. I love comedy. I love the history of comedy. I love new comedy. I love going to watch comedians still. And I think the circuit, until this interrupted us, I think the circuit is as interesting a place as it's been for a long, long time. There are a lot of brilliant young comics out there, and remember we talked about the rose-tinted spectacles, about early stand-up comedy. For all, early stand-up comedy was brilliant. Early alternative comedy was brilliant. There were very few black acts. There were very few Asian acts. There were very few openly gay acts. And now young comedians reflect our society in a way that they've never done before. And there's some brilliant comics out there. My son being one of them, of course.
He's fantastic.
People like Rosie Jones and Red Richardson and Maisie Adam, Pierre Novelli. There's some brilliant comics out there. But all of us who love what we do love audience members who love it as well. So I appreciate talking to somebody like you who is as enthusiastic about what we do as you are.
So thank you so much for your kind words, and thank you so much for a wonderful interview, a wonderful chat. I've really enjoyed it.
Good, thank
you. I wish you every
you.
Success, and I will come and see you live again very, very soon, my friend.
I will make sure there's a chair or two in the front room in the front row, or the front room. It might be in my front room, Richard. Who knows? I'll make sure there's a chair with your name in the front row, mate.
You're very kind. Thank you so much for your time, and all the best to you.
Oh, mate.
Thanks now.